she'd created here with family and friends, moments of laughter, warmth, and togetherness. She walked in, dressed in her Sunday best, with a small, content smile on her lips. The aroma of freshly baked bread and the light hum of jazz music greeted her as she stepped inside, but something felt different this time. She paused, scanning the room for her reserved table. She had called ahead, as she always did, and spoken to a polite young woman on the phone who assured her the reservation was set. The restaurant was moderately busy, but as her eyes drifted to a young man behind the counter, someone she didn't recognize, she noticed something unsettling. His gaze, hard and unwelcoming, met hers. His stance was stiff, his brows furrowed in a way that made Evelyn's heart sink just a little. This wasn't the reception she was expecting. Her hand tightened on the small handbag she carried, her knuckles whitening as she approached the counter with a smile, determined to maintain her cheerful demeanor. "Good afternoon," she said softly. "I have a reservation under the name Evelyn Harper." The young man, whose name tag read Stephen Cooper, barely glanced up from his notepad. His lips curled into a sneer that made Evelyn feel instantly small, like an intruder in a place where she no longer belonged. His voice was clipped, devoid of the warmth or professionalism she was used to. "No tables available," he muttered, not bothering to look her in the eye. Evelyn blinked, taken aback. "But she began, her voice faltering slightly as she tried to explain. "I called yesterday and made a reservation. It should be under Harper."
Stephen's eyes flicked up from his notepad for a brief moment, and something cold and condescending passed over his face. It was the same look Evelyn had encountered all her life, in places where her presence wasn't welcome, where the color of her skin immediately set her apart as other. It was the look of someone who didn't see her as equal. She felt her chest tighten, but she kept her composure.
"There are no tables," Stephen repeated, louder this time, as if that would make his statement more final, more authoritative. He glanced around the room, making sure the other diners could hear the exchange. Evelyn's eyes quickly scanned the restaurant. There were clearly several empty tables, some by the window, others along the wall, waiting to be filled. Yet here she stood, being told there was no room for her. Evelyn frowned but kept her tone polite. "I see that there are a few tables over there." She gestured toward the open spaces, "perhaps one of those." Stephen interrupted her with a huff of impatience. "I said there are no tables for you. This isn't up for discussion." He crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back slightly, a smirk forming on his face. The words "for you" hung in the air like a noxious cloud, thick with an unspoken meaning that cut deeper than any insult. He didn't need to say it outright. Evelyn knew exactly what he meant. People like her didn't belong here. At least not anymore. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons beginning to turn toward her. Their glances were curious, some sympathetic, others indifferent. But none of them spoke up. Her heart sank further, a weight of shame and anger pressing down on her. She had faced this kind of treatment many times before, in different forms at different stages of her life. She had hoped foolishly, perhaps, that in a place like this, where she was known and had always felt comfortable, she would be immune to it.
But racism has a way of creeping into the most unexpected places, Evelyn thought. It disguises itself in polite refusals and indifferent smiles, in the coldness of a waiter's dismissive words. It's in the refusal to serve you, not because there truly isn't a table, but because there's something about you that makes you unworthy of being served. Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't want to cause a scene. Her mother had always taught her to maintain her dignity, even in the face of injustice. But how could she stay silent? How could she accept this without standing up for herself?
"I've been coming here for years," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've never had a problem before. Are you sure there isn't a table for me?" Stephen chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You're not listening, Mom," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "There are no tables available for you today. Maybe you should try someplace else. Or maybe. He let his voice trail off as he gave her a quick, dismissive glance from her worn handbag to her modest shoes. Maybe you're just not a good fit for this place anymore. The implication hit Evelyn like a slap in the face. She felt her stomach churn with a mixture of disbelief and anger. How could he be so brazen, so unapologetically cruel? She had spent years trying to forget moments like this, trying to believe that the world had changed, that people had changed. But here she was, an elderly black woman, being told in no uncertain terms that she didn't belong in a restaurant she had once called her own haven.
"I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to stay composed. "Why are you treating me this way? I have a reservation. I've been coming here for a long time."
Stephen's smirk widened, and he crossed his arms over his chest. "I don't care how long you've been coming here," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "There are no tables for you. You don't belong here." Evelyn felt a rush of heat rise to her cheeks. The injustice of it all, the sheer audacity of this young man to treat her like she was invisible, like she was less than human, less than worthy. She had lived through too much, fought too hard, to be spoken to this way, especially in a place she had always considered a safe haven. But as much as the fire of indignation burned within her, she could also feel the familiar weight of exhaustion pulling her down. She was tired of fighting these battles, tired of defending her right to exist, to be treated with dignity and respect. She had spent her whole life facing this kind of discrimination, in one form or another. But even so, she had never let it break her spirit, and she wasn't about to start now.
She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and met Stephen's gaze head-on. "I want to speak to the manager," she said, her voice firm and unwavering.
Stephen's smirk faltered slightly, but he didn't back down. "Fine," he said, shrugging, "but it won't make a difference. People like you don't belong in places like this."
Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of anger and determination flooding her veins. She wouldn't let him win. Not today, not ever. As Stephen walked away to fetch the manager, Evelyn stood rooted to the spot, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to collect her thoughts. The quiet murmur of the restaurant seemed louder now, the glances of the diners more piercing. She could feel the weight of their silent judgments pressing down on her. Some seemed to pity her, while others simply looked uncomfortable, as though they wished the whole thing would just go away.
But Evelyn knew she couldn't let it go. Not this time. She had come too far, lived through too much, to turn her back now. Stephen returned a few moments later with a woman in tow, Martha Jenkins, the restaurant manager. Martha's face was tense, her eyes darting between Evelyn and the empty tables that stood as silent witnesses to the injustice unfolding.
The soft hum of conversation and the gentle clink of glasses filled the restaurant, a cozy and familiar place where Evelyn had often come to enjoy meals. Today her steps were slow, but her heart was light. It was her birthday, and she looked forward to celebrating quietly, surrounded by the warm ambience of the restaurant she had come to love. As she approached the hostess stand, she was greeted not by the usual friendly faces, but by a new waiter, his youthful face creased with an impatient frown.
"Good afternoon," she said with a smile, her voice steady but kind. "I reserved a table under my name, Evelyn Harper."
The young man, Stephen, glanced at her with eyes that flicked from her worn handbag to her neatly pressed but modest attire. His look was one she knew all too well. That flash of dismissal, the subtle sneer just below the surface. It was a look that had followed her all her life, from segregated classrooms to boardrooms where her voice was too often silenced. He didn't bother to check the reservation list. "There are no tables available," he said, his tone cold and detached. Evelyn blinked, taken aback for a moment. "Oh, but I called yesterday," she said, her brow furrowing slightly. "I confirmed my reservation with the manager. Perhaps there's been a mistake."
Stephen's sigh was loud and exaggerated, as though he were already weary of her presence. He crossed his arms and fixed her with a stare that stripped away any sense of customer service. I said, "There are no tables," he repeated, each word slower and more condescending than the last. "You should try somewhere else." Her heart tightened at the familiar sting of those words, somewhere else. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to push her to the margins, to make her feel like she didn't belong. The polite veneer of the restaurant suddenly felt suffocating, the warmth she had anticipated now a chilling reminder that places of comfort could still harbor spaces of exclusion. Evelyn steadied herself, her hands clasping her purse a little tighter. She didn't want to make a scene. At her age, she had learned to pick her battles carefully. But this was not something she could let pass.